Every July 4th, the United States tells itself the same story. 13 poor colonies, armed with courage and hunting rifles, overthrew the world's greatest empire, an epic tale of free men against tyranny. But what few people know is that the gunpowder those colonies used came from Bilbao, that the meat that fed the southern flank of the war came from ranches in Spanish Texas, with cattle driven by mixed-race cowboys, that the money that finally paid George Washington's soldiers was raised in Havana, Cuba, in a matter of days, and that the man who drove the British out of the entire Gulf of Mexico was neither American nor French, but a general from Malaga, a subject of the absolutist Catholic king. The Spain of Charles III was not a distracted bystander in the independence of the United States. It was one of the powers that made it possible, and even so, it is the only major ally that was deliberately hidden from the American founding myth. And this immediately raises a series of questions. Why would the Catholic Empire finance Protestant rebels to overthrow their own king? Why was this help conveniently erased from history? And what does this have to do with the United States taking 230 years to hang a painting on the wall? In today's video, we're going to reconstruct Spain's forgotten role in the independence of the United States and show why this erasure is directly related to the American disregard for the Hispanic world. But before we start the video, if you like our content, become a member of our channel right now. This way, you'll have access to our group and exclusive content, including live classes, so you can go even deeper behind the scenes of history. To understand Spain's actions in this war, we must first analyze the map of the Americas at that time. When we think about America in 1776, we imagine the 13 colonies on the east coast and emptiness to the west. But that emptiness wasn't empty. It was Spanish. During the 7 Years' War, Spain had received all of Louisiana from France, a gigantic territory that stretched from New Orleans to Canada. In other words, the western border of the American rebels was Spain, and the Mississippi River was the only supply route that the British couldn't block with their navy. That's because it was a Spanish river. At the same time, Spain had a score to settle. In the 7 Years' War, the British had taken Havana and Manila, and Spain had been forced to give up Florida to get them back. And King Carlos III did not forget that. So when the English colonists began to rebel against London, Spain saw supporting them as a strategic opportunity. And the help begins long before any declaration of war. It starts in secret, in a trading house in Bilbao. Diego Maria de Godorquí was a Basque merchant educated in England who spoke English perfectly well and had many contacts in the ports of the 13 colonies. He was the ideal man for an operation that needed to seem unofficial. In 1776, with Washington's army practically scattered and out of gunpowder, his company began shipping supplies to the rebels. The supplies included thousands of blankets, pairs of shoes, campaign tents, muskets, bayonets, as well as hundreds of cannons and lots of gunpowder. And saltpeter? The numbers are impressive and also vary, precisely because the operation was secret and involved several cities and constant shipments coming from all over Spain. The historian Larry Ferrero, in his work Brothers at Arms, even estimates that France and Spain together supplied about 90% of all the firearms used by the Americans in the war. And according to Canal, there was something even more ingenious. Whoever controlled the rivers controlled the logistics, and the Spanish controlled the Mississippi. The governor of Spanish Louisiana, Luis de Gonzaga, and later his successor, they authorized gunpowder, medicine, and weapons to be sent up the river from New Orleans and delivered to the rebels. This was done through an Irish intermediary named Oliver Pollock. Without this corridor, the American campaigns in the interior would have died of starvation. And it was through this river that Spain helped hold the entire West, while Washington was losing battles in the East. But then, we have an uncomfortable detail that explains why the Spanish were later forgotten. On April 12, 1779. Spain informed France, signed the Treaty of Aranjuez on June 21, and Spain declared war on Great Britain, but the Spanish treaty was with France and not with the United States. Carlos III never formally recognized American independence during the war and never signed an alliance with the Continental Congress. And the reason is the perfect irony. Spain itself was the owner of the largest empire in the world at that time. To publicly recognize that colonists had the right to break free from their mother country was to sign their own death sentence in Mexico, in Peru, and in the Rio de la Plata. So Spain preferred to enter the war to fight England and recover Gibraltar, Minorca, and the Floridas, without expressly declaring support for the Americans. The help would come then as a consequence, not as a goal. And that's exactly why it was so easy to erase later. Because the ally who never signed anything is not really an ally and can therefore be easily forgotten. And that's when the most underestimated man in American history comes into play, Bernardo de Gálvez, who was the governor of Spanish Louisiana. He was just over 30 years old and had an extensive record of fighting against the Apaches. As soon as the war is declared, Gálvez doesn't even wait for reinforcements from Havana. He attacks first in the fall of 1779 with about 1,400 men. He sweeps through the British posts on the Mississippi, attacks Manchac, Baton Rouge, and Natchez, and the following year takes Mobile. And in 1781 comes the crowning achievement of the campaign. Pensacola, the capital of British West Florida, is where the most famous scene of his life takes place, as pointed out by historian Manuel Huerta Gonzalez from the University of Cordoba. The Spanish fleet's admiral refused to enter the bay, claiming it was too shallow and that the British batteries were too deadly. The naval commander and Gálvez have a serious argument. Gálvez then boards his brigantine and enters the bay alone, to prove it was possible even under enemy trawling. The fleet, embarrassed, follows him shortly after, and Pensacola falls in May 1781, and thus Great Britain loses all its naval bases in the Gulf of Mexico. King Charles III rewards Gálvez, allowing him to display the brigantine on his own coat of arms with the motto, Yo Solo, or I alone. And, in this sense, it is important to highlight the support and the food provided for the campaign. The governor of Spanish Texas received a request from Gálvez for food to support the soldiers, especially after a great famine caused by a hurricane passing through the region. The governor responded and moved between 10,000 and 15,000 head of cattle from Texas, using Spanish and mixed-race cowboys who raised cattle on ranches. But Spain's war effort was not limited to the south. On May 26, 1780, the British launched a major offensive on the upper Mississippi. The target was St. Louis, a fur trading village under Spanish rule. The defense was under the command of Fernando de Leyva, a sick and resource-poor officer. He had about 30 regular soldiers and a militia of around 200 men, almost all of them French traders and hunters. And against him, more than 1,000 indigenous warriors, allies of the British. He then raised money from the residents and hastily built a stone tower called Fort San Carlos on a shallow line of trenches. He only had time to finish one tower, but it was enough to repel the attacks. And with this Spanish success, the British would never be able to control the Mississippi Valley. Today, where that tower once stood, is one of the legs of the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, a monument dedicated to America's westward expansion. There is no greater irony since that West was Spanish. And here we come to the decisive moment. In 1781, George Washington was in a humiliating situation. He didn't have money to pay his own soldiers. Regiments from Pennsylvania and Connecticut mutinied, and he even ordered the execution of leaders of the mutiny to restore discipline. France, which was supposed to fund everything, was financially exhausted, And it was in the midst of this confusion that Francisco de Saavedra y Sangronis came onto the scene. He makes a decisive agreement with the French. The Spanish fleet would cover the French possessions in the Caribbean so that the French commander de Grasse could take absolutely all of his warships to North America. And Spain would also help with money, largely with contributions from Spanish Caribbean merchants. And so in September, the Spanish money was handed over by the French to pay the American army. And with that, in 1781, the British surrendered at Yorktown. This victory was only possible because of Spanish silver and also because there was no British fleet in the Gulf of Mexico that could come up to help their army, since all of them had been defeated by Gálvez 5 months earlier. But that wasn't all. While Gálvez was taking Pensacola, Spain was besieging Gibraltar for more than 3 years. It recaptured Minorca, took the Bahamas from the British, and pushed the British off the coast of Central America, capturing several convoys. In the Atlantic, every British ship defending Gibraltar during the siege was a ship that wasn't bombarding Boston. Every regiment in the Caribbean was a regiment that wasn't chasing Washington. So the United States didn't defeat the British Empire alone. They were just one of the fronts of an empire that was being stretched across all the oceans at the same time. Both by the French and Spanish Bourbon, but especially by the Spanish. And what's interesting is that the Americans, at the time of the fighting, acknowledged the Spanish support. George Washington became a personal friend of a Spanish spy named Juan de Morales, who helped finance the revolution by securing supplies and ammunition for the American troops. And when he fell ill and died at the Morristown camp, Washington, against his own convictions, even arranged a Catholic requiem mass for his burial. But then comes the tragic part. On paper, Spain came out victorious, regained Minorca, regained the Floridas, and secured positions in the Gulf. But in practice, Spain had created its own executioner. No sooner had the war ended than the conflict with the new country began, especially over navigation on the Mississippi River. The same Luis de Gonzaga, who had armed Washington, began negotiating with the adversary, with the United States, who wanted the whole river. And the rest everyone knows. In 1803, Louisiana changed hands and was sold to Jefferson, and in 1819, Florida was handed over. Between 1846 and 1848, the United States took half of Mexico's territory, and in 1898 they took Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, wiping out what was left of the Spanish Empire. Spain helped create the nation that would swallow the Hispanic world in North America. And this hostility toward the Spanish was not a matter of chance, but rather a narrative necessity. The term Black Legend was established by the Spanish writer Julian Ruderius in 1914, and it described the image built over centuries by the English and the Dutch. That of Spain as the kingdom of the Inquisition, of fanaticism, cruelty, laziness, and racial degeneration. The exact opposite of everything that a Protestant, mercantile, and free people should be. This image was not just random prejudice. It was, in fact, a tool of war, especially propaganda used by Spain's imperial rivals, and this mentality found fertile ground among the English colonists. And this is where the work of Professor Maria de Guzman from the University of North Carolina comes in. In her book, The Long Shadow of Spain, she shows that the Black Legend was not only imported by American culture, it was essential to the very construction of Anglo-American identity. Spain functioned as the colonial alter ego of the United States, the mirror image that needed to be hated so that the United States could define itself this way. They needed there to be an empire, which they were not, a dominating empire that in fact did not bring oppression, but rather freedom. A nation born to Protestant virtue against an inquisitorial Catholic tyranny. And in this way, Spanish help simply didn't fit. France did, France embodied Enlightenment ideals. It had Lafayette helping free men. But Spain needed to be the opposite. It needed to play the role of the villain. So the solution they came up with was elegant. Not to deny Spain, but simply not to mention it, and thus let its participation slip into the footnotes. And this disregard for Spain would bring many consequences. In the 19th century, it became manifest destiny. The Hispanic peoples were indolent, superstitious, too mixed, racially inferior, and incapable of self-government. Therefore, taking their lands is not a conquest, but rather a form of civilizing hygiene. In 1898, it became a justification to liquidate the Spanish Empire in the name of freedom. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, it survives in the image of the Hispanic as the eternal foreigner, the one who is always seen as having just arrived and who never really belonged there, who in fact is asking for permission to exist. But history tells the opposite. Santa Fe is older than Boston. St. Augustine in Florida is older than Jamestown. There were Spanish missions and ranches in Texas and California even before the United States existed, and Hispanics were already there. After the founding, he was there driving the cattle that sustained the founding, the vaquero, in the lands, who crossed hundreds of kilometers with the herd. Gálvez wasn't an immigrant to American history. He was part of its origins. And here we come to the greatest irony of this story. On May 9, 1783, the Continental Congress of the United States passed a formal resolution that the portrait of Bernardo de Gálvez would be hung in the meeting place of Congress, alongside the Founding Fathers. In recognition of what he had done for American independence, the resolution was passed and then simply nothing happened. For 231 years, no one fulfilled that promise, which was conveniently forgotten. Until, already in the 21st century, a Spanish woman living in Washington named Teresa Valcarce happened to read about it and decided to press for it, going from office to office, and in this way she finally succeeded. In 2014, Gálvez's portrait was finally hung in the Capitol. And a few days later, Congress approved, and the President signed the proclamation of Bernardo de Gálvez as an honorary citizen of the United States. He was only the eighth in history, after Lafayette, Churchill, and Mother Teresa of Calcutta. It took 231 years of delay to hang a portrait that had already been approved. Maybe that's what the Black Legend really is. It's not just a lie someone tells, but also a truth that's omitted, or a portrait that no one hangs. Spain didn't fight out of love for American freedom. It fought for its own interests, and it never recognized that independence while the war lasted. But without the gunpowder from Bilbao, without the river of New Orleans, without the cattle from Texas, without St. Louis, without Pensacola, and without the silver from Havana, the flag that flies today over Yorktown would probably still be British. And you? Did you know that Spain played this role in the United States War of Independence? Did you know that the money for Yorktown came from Havana? What surprised you the most? So leave your comment right now to support our work and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. This way, you'll be able to go deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.